It took more than 3 years after the stock market crash of October 1929 for the economy to hit rock bottom. Industrial production, employment, investment, and farm prices declined precipitously. Meanwhile, most politicians, the heads of the Federal Reserve System, economists, and business leaders predicted that after a couple of tough years, the economy would inevitably recover. Downturns, they argued, were simply part of a natural business cycle in which periodic panics drove out speculators and lowered wages and the price of goods in preparation for renewed growth. The Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, shared the belief of bankers in Europe that the most important thing to do in any economic crisis was to maintain the gold standard that linked a nation's currency to its supply of gold and prevent inflation. When in 1930 and 31, President Hoover brought together business leaders to discuss ways to boost employment and stabilize tumbling prices, professional economists criticized this so-called misguided activism, which they said might delay recovery by undermining faith in the dollar's link to gold. In 1931, the heads of some of the biggest corporations, such as U.S. Steel, the Ford Motor Company, and the New York Stock Exchange, buoyed by a brief economic uptick, declared the worst of the Depression already over. In December, President Hoover assured Congress that the fundamentals of the economic system were sound and that only dislocations, shocks, and setbacks from abroad delayed recovery. Soon after this, the economy collapsed and the capitalist system, both at home and abroad, broke down almost completely. In 1929, President Hoover and the Republican Party took credit for 8 years of economic growth that produced what they called a new era. But by late 1932, Hoover's earlier prediction that poverty would soon be banished sounded absurd to most Americans. Gross annual domestic investment fell from $16 billion to $1 billion. Stocks lost almost 90% of their value, and a fifth of the nation's 25,000 banks failed. Residential and business construction, steel production, and automobile output fell by 1/2. At least 20% of workers, 12 million people, were unemployed. The overall economy shrank by 33%. About 40% of Americans still lived in rural areas, and a quarter of the workforce held jobs related to agriculture, such as farming, food processing, building farm implements, and so forth. By 1932, prices for grain, cotton, dairy, and livestock had fallen to half their 1926 level. On a single day in 1932, 1/4 of all the farmland in Mississippi was sold at auction. The U.S. didn't lack raw materials, labor, or even capital, but investment in commerce had completely stalled. Instead of taking advantage of bargains as economic theorists predicted, nervous investors and banks stopped putting money into consumer industries such as cars and electric appliances because of declining demand. As unsold inventories mounted and investment funds dried up, factories laid off more workers, further driving down demand. As the economy shrank at home, U.S. banks and investors stopped making foreign loans, and by 1933, international trade declined by 2/3 from its 1920s peak. In a futile effort to boost domestic sales by walling off imports, Congress, in 1930, adopted the Smoot-Hawley tariff that hiked duties on foreign goods. Most other countries enacted similar protectionist measures to shield home industry and agriculture from imports. These actions had the net effect of hurting just about everyone. As national income declined, Germany first reduced, then, under Hitler, simply stopped paying World War I reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France, in turn, stopped paying their war debts to the U.S. When British economist John Maynard Keynes was asked if anything in history resembled this array of economic calamities, he replied, "Yes, It was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. The scope of what was being called the Great Depression revealed the stark reality of poverty in America. During the boom time of the 1920s, the poor had been characterized as people on society's margins, comprised mostly of immigrants, people of color, the elderly, and those living in rural backwaters. But by the winter of 1932-33, around 15 million mostly white, urban males, 25% of the workforce, were chronically unemployed. Business and local governments often fired married women workers to preserve jobs for male heads of households. Because the federal government kept few statistics, even 15 million was probably a low estimate of unemployment and did not count those working just a few hours per week or desperate farmers, sharecroppers, or tenants who worked outside the cash economy. Out of a total population of 126 million people, probably close to half of all Americans lived a hand-to-mouth existence. Conditions were so bad that crowds routinely gathered at municipal dumps to rummage through garbage for food. African Americans, who comprised about 10% of the population and lived mostly in the rural South, faced even worse conditions. As cotton prices fell, landowners threw many families off the small plots they tilled. In the North, blacks worked mainly in the lower rungs of industry or in service and domestic jobs. Factory owners replaced many blacks with downwardly mobile white workers, while struggling middle-class white families fired blacks who worked as cooks, cleaners, and nannies. About two-thirds of the black workforce in New York and Chicago, the centers of African American population in the North, had no jobs at all. With little or no aid from federal or state agencies, local governments and private charities were overwhelmed. By law, most state and city governments had to balance their budgets. When local property taxes declined, cities and states fired municipal workers and reduced already meager social service budgets. Private charities run by religious and voluntary groups like the Salvation Army and Red Cross were equipped to assist individual hardship cases or emergency victims of floods or fires, not millions of long-term unemployed workers and their families. By one estimate, private charities could help only 5% of those in need. Hoover rejected pleas that he spend federal funds to directly assist the unemployed. Decrying this as a raid upon the Treasury, the president insisted that the federal government had no obligation to the unemployed and that providing assistance would only create dependency, not jobs. In the summer of 1932, Hoover backed congressional passage of an emergency bill that provided some funds for local governments for construction projects, but no aid went directly to the unemployed. That June, around 45,000 people, including 17,000 unemployed World War I vets, trekked to Washington, D.C. White and black vets and their families camped together in fields and abandoned buildings they derisively called Hoovervilles. The vets demanded immediate payment of a $1,000 pension or bonus that Congress had approved in 1924 for distribution in 1945. Hoover pressured lawmakers to refuse early payment. As a consolation, Congress offered to give the bonus marchers of the so-called Bonus Expeditionary Force free bus and train tickets home. 6,000 people accepted the offer, and others left on their own. By late July, around 15,000 demonstrators remained in the Capitol. On July 28th, Hoover ordered police and the Army, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, to clear the city of so-called revolutionaries. Most Americans were appalled as tanks and cavalry rousted the protesters and burned their encampments, killing 2 veterans and a child.
Hoover asked General Douglas MacArthur to lead a force to aid the Washington, D.C. police to remove the bonus marchers from these buildings and drive them back to their Anacostia Flats in Washington, where they had this so-called encampment. MacArthur exceeded his orders very dramatically. Not only drove the marchers out of the buildings and back to Anacostia Flats, but then he put their camp to the torch. Now, for reasons that aren't altogether clear, Hoover never publicly took MacArthur to task for this, and Hoover took onto himself the responsibility for this action, which was politically pretty nearly fatal. I mean, there's probably no single event in 1932 that was better utilized to symbolize Hoover's alleged callousness and indifference to the plight of the unemployed than the fate of the bonus marchers.
By 1932, many Americans were dissatisfied with the federal government and ready for a change. President Hoover was widely disliked, but the violent repression of the bonus army finished him politically. That fall, a majority of voters would look to new leadership to take action where Hoover had fallen short.